Eastern St. Andrew, to some its home. To Christopher Linton, it was a chessboard. Known to the world as Dogpa, he was a man who didn't just lead a gang. He commanded a militia of 40 gunmen. To the Jamaica Constabulary Force, he was a ghost, a monster, the commander of 40 rifles. To the residents of Augustown, he was an inevitability, a force of nature that shaped their daily lives. But in this episode, we peel back the ballistic vest. We look past the most wanted posters and the sensational headlines. We explore the man who would orchestrate the incineration of a family, yet spent his nights in a Horizon remand cell, weeping in total solitude. The man who allegedly ordered the execution of a 6-year-old child, yet was described by his partner as a loving protector and best friend. How does a promising student from Jamaica College, the prestigious institution that has produced prime ministers and Rhodes Scholars, become the most feared gang leader of a generation? How does a boy with options become a man who commands an army of gunmen? This is not just the story of one criminal. This is the story of duality, of a man trapped between his own myth and his mortality, of wasted potential and extreme violence, of high society romance and underworld brutality. This is the complete saga of Christopher Linton, a 35-year odyssey of blood, power, and the tears behind the terror. Born around 1986 in Augustown, St. Andrew, Christopher Linton's life would span just 3.5 decades. But in that brief time, he would leave an indelible mark on Jamaica's criminal landscape, a legacy that continues to haunt the nation long after his death on October 11, 2021. This is the story of the boy who could have been a leader of industry, but became a leader of infantry, the scholar who became a shooter, the protector who became a predator. This is the complete chronicle of Christopher Dogpa Linton. Christopher Linton was not born into the gutter. Unlike many who are forced into the gang life out of pure desperation, Linton's early years were marked by an opportunity few in Augustown ever receive. Thanks to the support of local benefactors who saw potential in the young boy and his 3 brothers, Christopher was sent to a prominent prep school, a world away from the zinc fences and concrete jungles of the ghetto. By the time he entered Jamaica College, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the Caribbean, the expectations were sky high. Jamaica College has produced prime ministers, Rhodes Scholars, and some of the nation's most respected leaders. For Christopher Linton, the path to success was laid out before him, a future of academic achievement, professional accomplishment, and social mobility. But the culture of the garrison was already calling. Augustown is not just a community. It is a political and social ecosystem where loyalty to political parties and allegiance to gang leaders are deeply intertwined. In these streets, respect isn't earned through academic achievement. It's taken through strength and intimidation. Even in 7th grade, while his classmates were studying algebra and literature, Christopher Linton had already claimed the moniker Dogpa and was running a small-scale gang among his peers. The streets pulled harder than the classroom. He wasn't interested in textbooks. He was interested in territory. He wasn't studying for exams. He was studying the power structures of the criminal underworld. His academic career was short-lived. Expelled from Jamaica College for his involvement in gang activities, he was given a second chance at Dunoon Technical, but the pattern repeated itself. Expelled again, Christopher Linton's formal education came to an abrupt end. By the time he was 19, the boy who could have been a leader of industry had become a leader of infantry. He studied the old dons, particularly Joel Andem, the notorious leader of the Gideon Warriors. He learned the art of extortion, the science of territorial control, the psychology of fear. When the old dons fell, either through incarceration or death, Dogpa into the vacuum he inherited. He built a throne. He filled the power vacuum left by incarcerated gangster Joel Andem, inheriting a legacy of violence that he would soon expand into a full-fledged criminal empire. The foundation had been laid for what would become one of Jamaica's most notorious criminal careers. But no one could have predicted the level of brutality that was to come. The crimes that would cement Linton's place in Jamaica's criminal history and ultimately lead to his downfall. The promising student was gone. In his place stood the gang leader. The transformation was complete. By 2010, the Dog Power Gang was no longer just a group of shooters. It was a shadow government. Under Christopher Linton's command, the gang branched into sophisticated criminal enterprises that went far beyond simple street crime. They ran the Papine, Tavern, and Augusttown areas with a chilling corporate efficiency that would make any legitimate business executive envious. They didn't just rob, they regulated. They didn't just intimidate, they administered. The Dog Paw Gang operated with military precision, controlling territory through fear, discipline, and an intricate network of informants and enforcers. Their criminal portfolio was diverse and lucrative. They controlled illegal sand mining operations in the Hope River, a multi-million-dollar enterprise that funded their arsenal and provided income for their foot soldiers. They ran extortion rackets so tight and systematic that transport operators and business owners considered the gang's tax more certain and predictable than the government's own taxation system. If you were building a house in Eastern St. Andrew, you bought your sand from Dogpaw. If you were driving a taxi through Papine, you paid his protection money. If you owned a shop in Augusttown, you contributed to his coffers. This wasn't random violence. This was organized crime on an industrial scale. The Dogpaw Gang had become a parallel economy, a criminal corporation that operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. But with power came paranoia. Linton's internal discipline was legendary, bordering on fanatical. In late 2010, word spread through the underworld that a loyalist named Randy Evans had been executed, shot dead in cold blood, simply for failing to carry out a direct order from Linton while he was incarcerated. This management by fear ensured that while other gangs were fractured by infighting and betrayal, the Dogpaw Gang remained a singular, lethal unit. Loyalty was rewarded, failure was punished with death. But this unity came at a horrific price for the community. The Dogpaw Gang's reign of terror included multiple unprosecuted shootings of residents and rival gang members. Communities that had once been vibrant and close-knit were now fractured by fear and intimidation. Children grew up surrounded by violence, and many families were forced to flee their homes to escape the gang's influence. The year 2010 marked the peak of Linton's brutality, and the moment when he crossed a line that would forever define his legacy. In December of that year, the nation saw the true face of the dog. The Bedward Gardens massacre was not just another gang killing. It was a message written in fire and innocent blood. Imagine 40 men, armed with high-powered rifles, AK-47s and M16s, descending on a single family home like a death squad. They didn't just shoot. They liquidated everything inside. The victims, 50-year-old Maris Hilton, 31-year-old Diana Forbes, and her 6-year-old son, Jahami McKay. When the bullet stopped, the fire started. They burned the house to ash to ensure no soul escaped. This wasn't a gang war. It was a statement, a demonstration of absolute power, a warning to anyone who dared to cross Christopher Dogpaw Linton. The death of 6-year-old Jahami McKay shattered any remaining image of Linton as a Robin Hood figure or community protector. To the law, he was now a virus that needed to be eradicated. To the nation, he was a monster who had crossed into territory so dark that redemption seemed impossible. But Linton's arrogance knew no bounds. He didn't just hide in the shadows. He engaged the state directly. On Tavern Drive to the cold-blooded execution of his own men, Linton proved one thing. In his world, there was no room for mercy, and no one was safe from the paw. By late 2010, Christopher Linton had become Jamaica's most wanted man. Police offered a $250,000 bounty for his capture, and a massive dragnet was launched to bring him to justice. But Linton was not easily caught. He publicly rebuffed police appeals to turn himself in, reportedly telling officers they would have to get past his gun first. This defiance only added to his legend and cemented his reputation as a man who feared no one. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between law enforcement and one of Jamaica's most dangerous criminals. But before that confrontation could occur, Linton would need to be captured, and that would prove to be no easy task. The dragnet finally closed in on January 24th, 2011. In a massive joint police-military operation that swarmed the hills of Kintyre and Elliton Flats, the lion was finally caged. They didn't find him in a fortified bunker or surrounded by armed guards. They found him hiding in a modest house in the company of two women. As he was led away in handcuffs, his face, once a symbol of untouchable power, was stone cold. The man who had terrorized Eastern St. Andrew for years was now just another prisoner. In 2013, the gavel fell. After a lengthy legal battle, Christopher Linton was sentenced to 15 years in prison for illegal possession of a firearm and shooting with intent. The charges stem from an April 2010 incident where he and an accomplice allegedly shot at two police officers traveling in a service vehicle along Tavern Drive. While this conviction represented a significant victory for law enforcement, it was bittersweet. Linton had escaped punishment for the most heinous crimes attributed to him, the Bedward Gardens triple murder. In 2017, he was freed of those charges when key witnesses failed to appear in court, a legal technicality that allowed him to walk away from the brutal killings of Maris Hilton, Diana Forbes, and 6-year-old Jaham McKay. But while the public celebrated his incarceration, a different story was emerging from behind the prison walls. At the Horizon Adult Remand Center, the feared gang leader was just another inmate, subject to the same rules and restrictions as everyone else. And in the solitude of his cell, something remarkable happened. Something that would challenge everything we think we know about monsters. According to reports from former correctional officers and inmates, Christopher Linton would sometimes cry alone in his cell at night. The man who commanded 40 gunmen, who struck fear into entire communities, who orchestrated brutal murders. This same man was capable of profound vulnerability and emotion. These weren't tears of regret for the blood spilled, but the private grief of a man trapped between his own myth and his mortality. The man who had built an empire of fear was now spiritually broken, haunted by his isolation and the crumbling of his criminal kingdom. He turned to religion, or at least the appearance of it, as his legal team prepared for what would become a Hail Mary play in the Court of Appeal. But the tears continued. Night after night, in the dead silence of his cell, the monster wept. These tears represented the chasm between the public persona of Dogpaw, the feared gang leader, and the private man, Christopher Linton, a man capable of both great evil and profound humanity. But the narrative of Linton's life took a bizarre and unexpected turn during his decade behind bars. He began a high-profile relationship with Leah Tavares Finson, the daughter of noted attorney and Senate President Tom Tavares Finson. This relationship was particularly jarring, given the vast difference in their backgrounds. Leah Tavares Finson came from one of Jamaica's most prominent political families, the pinnacle of Jamaican society, while Christopher Linton was a convicted gang leader with a reputation for brutality that had shocked the nation. Despite this disparity, Leah stood by his side, defending him as a misunderstood protector and loving father. She described him as her best friend of 18 years, a man who loved his community with all his heart. She saw a side of Linton that the police never did, a man who was capable of love, loyalty, and protection. This duality, the man who would allegedly burn a family alive, and the man who was a great father and devoted partner, is what makes the Dogpaw story so haunting and complex. At his funeral in 2022, Leah delivered a tearful remembrance, famously asking, "How did he end up with me?" It was a moment that forced Jamaica to look at the human face of its most feared monster. Her defense from someone of her social standing added a layer of complexity to Linton's story and raised profound questions about the nature of love, loyalty, and the possibility of transformation. April 14th, 2021, in a stunning legal reversal that sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the communities that had suffered under Linton's reign, the Court of Appeal quashed his 15-year conviction. The judges ruled that the identification evidence used to convict him was fatally flawed and of poor quality. After nearly a decade behind bars, Christopher Dogpaw Linton was a free man. The gates of the prison swung open, and Dogpaw stepped out into the Jamaican sunlight, thinner but defiant. Flanked by his partner, Leah Tavares Finson, he looked into the cameras and uttered the words that would trend for weeks across social media and news outlets. Freedom is a must. It was a declaration of victory, a statement of defiance, a promise of return. But the August town that Linton returned to was not the August town he had left. The underworld he had helped build had moved on. Younger, hungrier shooters in rival factions like Jungle 12 and the Gaza crews were no longer taking orders from a man who had spent a decade behind bars. His influence had been denuded, his territory carved up by younger, more reckless lieutenants. He was a relic of a previous era of crime, a king without a kingdom. The celebration was short-lived, the peace was fragile. Violence followed him like a shadow. Only 2 months after his release, in June 2021, Linton was ambushed and shot in Bull Bay. He survived the attack, but the message was clear. The streets of St. Andrew no longer belonged to him. This was a warning shot from the shadows, a reminder that even the most feared gang leaders are not invincible, that the criminal world he had returned to was just as dangerous as he remembered, if not more so. The power vacuum created by his imprisonment had been filled by others, and they were not eager to relinquish their newfound influence. One of Linton's key associates, Romaine Diddy Richards, was shot and killed by rival gangsters in August 2021, signaling the volatile struggle for authority within the gang's former territory. This internal conflict demonstrated that the Dogpaw Gang was no longer the unified force it had once been under Linton's leadership. The organization was fracturing, and the return of its former leader was creating tensions that would ultimately prove fatal. But Christopher Linton was not a man who knew how to walk away. Despite the warnings, despite the ambush, despite the clear signs that his time had passed, he chose to step back into the game. Police intelligence indicated that he was immediately linked to several murders and shootings in the Elletson Flats and Tavern areas. Deputy Commissioner of Police Fitz Bailey stated that Linton was implicated in a fresh wave of violence that had gripped Eastern St. Andrews since his release. The pattern was familiar. Extortion rackets resumed, rival gang members were targeted, and communities once again lived in fear. Christopher Linton was back, and he was determined to re-establish his dominance in the criminal underworld. The lessons of prison, if there were any, had not been learned, or perhaps they had been deliberately ignored. The end finally came on October 11th, 2021, in the very community where he was first captured a decade earlier, Elletson Flats. It was as if fate had circled back to the place where his reign of terror had begun to meet his final reckoning. Christopher Linton was laid to rest at the Dovecot Memorial Park in St. Catherine on December 31st, 2021, bringing a final chapter to his tumultuous life. But notably, there was no sermon at his funeral, a reflection of the controversial nature of his legacy and the difficulty of finding words to honor a man whose life had been defined by both brutality and humanity. At his funeral, mourners remembered a man who loved people, while the state remembered a monster. His partner, Leah Tavares Finson, delivered a raw, emotional tribute, painting him not as a killer, but as a victim of a system that never let him change. She wept for the loving protector, while the rest of Jamaica reflected on the trail of terror he left behind. But as the dirt hit the casket, the families of Bedward Gardens remained in their own kind of prison. Linton's death brought no closure to the families of Maris Hilton, Diana Forbes, and 6-year-old Jahame McKay. For them, justice remained elusive, their grief compounded by the knowledge that the man responsible for their loved ones' murders had escaped conviction and died without ever facing trial for those crimes. When the smoke cleared over Ellerton Flats on that October afternoon, the physical body of Christopher Linton was gone, but his ghost continued to haunt the hills of St. Andrew. In the immediate aftermath of his death, security forces were placed on high alert, fearing that his remaining loyalists would launch a scorched earth retaliation against the state. Police braced for a blood flare-up as his cronies sought revenge. But the retaliation didn't come in a single wave. Instead, it manifested as a power vacuum. With the old guard officially dismantled, younger, more volatile factions within the Dogpaw gang and rival crews began a bloody scramble for the scraps of his empire. The extortion rackets in Papine and the drug routes through Augustown became the prizes in a new, even more disorganized war. For the residents of Augustown, Linton's death brought a complex mix of relief and terror. To some, he was the Don who provided school books and kept petty thieves at bay, a twisted form of community leadership that offered a semblance of order in chaos. To others, he was the shadow that darkened their lives, the reason they locked their gates before sunset, the architect of their fear. His death didn't bring peace. It brought uncertainty. Without a single leader to command the gunmen, the violence became unpredictable, a series of sporadic lone wolf shootings that made the streets feel more dangerous than ever. The communities of Eastern St. Andrew continue to heal from the wounds inflicted by Linton and the Dogpaw gang. Progress has been made, but the road to recovery is long and difficult. Christopher Dogpaw Linton's story is a study in contrasts, a man capable of orchestrating the murder of a 6-year-old child, yet one who would cry alone in his prison cell, a feared gang leader who commanded 40 gunmen, yet a man described by his partner as a loving father and protector, a criminal mastermind who struck terror into entire communities, yet a human being capable of profound vulnerability and emotion. His tears behind the terror challenge us to look beyond the simplistic labels we often apply to criminals, to see the humanity that exists even in the darkest of individuals. This is not to excuse or justify his crimes, but rather to recognize the complexity of human nature and the factors that shape our choices and actions. Thanks for watching. And if you found this deep dive into Jamaica's criminal underworld informative and compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Underworld Chronicles for more uncut stories of the Caribbean's most notorious figures. Remember, the underworld is closer than you think.